On the morning of October 12th, 1923, a man locked himself in the bathroom of his house in Northamptonshire and did not come out. His name was Charles Rothschild. He was 46 years old. He was a partner in N.M. Rothschild and Sons, the banking house that had financed the British war effort against Napoleon, and that had, over the course of a century, made the Rothschild name synonymous with a kind of financial power, so complete that governments sought its approval before they made their largest decisions. He was also a naturalist of genuine distinction, a man who had spent his life cataloging fleas and butterflies, who had bought Wicken Fen as Britain's first nature reserve, who had compiled a list of 284 sites across the British Isles that he believed should be protected forever from development. He had described 500 new species of flea. He had mapped the habitat of the bubonic plague vector on a trip to Sudan in 1901. He had met his Hungarian-born wife Rosika on a butterfly-collecting expedition in the Carpathian Mountains, and had loved her with the same methodical devotion he brought to his science. He was found with his throat cut. The family closed the door on this fact immediately. The official account described a man who had been suffering from chronic encephalitis, a brain inflammation that had been destroying his health for years and who had finally succumbed. The manner of his death, the locked bathroom, the razor, the blood was not the account that was offered to the world. The account that was offered was illness, long illness. The encephalitis was real, the suffering was real, and the family, which had spent a century building a name that banks and governments and newspapers treated with a particular reverence, was not prepared to add to that name the word suicide. They buried Charles Rothschild in the ground, and they buried the manner of his death in a silence that would hold, with the particular durability of things that powerful families choose to keep for decades. His son Victor was 13 years old. He was at school. He was at Harrow, the school that his father and his grandfather had attended before him, the school where his father had been bullied on account of his religion and had endured it in the way that Rothschild men were expected to endure the things that were done to them, quietly, privately, without making more of it than the family considered appropriate. Victor would later call his preparatory school a hellhole. He said less about Harrow, which is itself a kind of statement. He was 13, and his father was dead, and the family had decided what the story of that death was going to be, and Victor was inside that story whether he chose to be or not. This is where Victor Rothschild begins, not with the barony, not with Cambridge, not with the Cambridge apostles or the flat he shared with spies or the bomb disposal work or the accusation that shadowed the last decade of his life. He begins in a school dormitory in the autumn of 1923, a boy of 13 who has just been told that his father is dead and who is being told, simultaneously and by the same people, what he is allowed to say about how. He is not allowed to say much. He will spend the rest of his life in that posture, knowing things he cannot say, carrying things he cannot put down, moving through the world of the most powerful institutions of the 20th century with a particular understanding of what secrets cost and what they protect and what they eventually destroy. He will learn this first at 13 in the manner of his father's death, and he will never fully learn it any other way. Before we go further, drop your city in the comments. And if these stories, the ones buried inside the most powerful names in the world, matter to you, hit subscribe. It costs nothing. Now let us go back to the house where Charles Rothschild locked the door, and let us look at what was on the other side of it. The Rothschild banking dynasty began in a Jewish ghetto in Frankfurt in the middle of the 18th century. Meyer Amschel Rothschild, the patriarch, grew up in the Judengasse, the Jews' Lane, the narrow, overcrowded street in the Old City where Frankfurt's Jewish population was confined by law and by the particular customs of exclusion that European society had developed over centuries for managing the people it did not fully accept. The ghetto was not a metaphor. It was a physical enclosure with gates that were locked at night, from which the residents emerged each morning to conduct whatever business the city permitted them, and to which they returned each evening under the instruction of people who had decided, on their behalf, what kind of freedom they were entitled to. Mayor Amschel understood the ghetto the way people understand the things that shape them, completely and without the luxury of distance. He became a coin dealer, then a court agent, then a banker, moving carefully through the spaces that the law opened and the spaces that money could open that the law had not. He placed his 5 sons in 5 European cities, Frankfurt, Vienna, London, Paris, Naples, and built between them a network of communication and coordination that allowed the family to move money and information across borders faster than any government institution of the era could match. Nathan Rothschild, the London Sun, received news of Wellington's victory at Waterloo a full day before the British government's own messengers arrived with the same information. He did not use this advantage for the financial coup that popular legend has always assigned to him. The story is false, documented as false, repeated for 2 centuries anyway because it fits the template of the conspiracy that the Rothschild name has always attracted. What Nathan did was report the news to the government immediately. Then, 2 years later, he bought government bonds at a moment when he had correctly calculated that post-war peace would produce a rebound in their price. He waited. He sold at 40% profit. This is what banking looks like when it is done by someone who is very good at it. It is not conspiracy, it is competence. But competence for a Jewish family accumulating power in 19th century Europe was indistinguishable from threat to the people who needed it to be a threat. The anti-Semitic pamphlets began almost immediately. The conspiracy theories multiplied with each decade and each generation and each new accumulation of Rothschild wealth and Rothschild influence. They accused the family of controlling governments, manipulating markets, engineering wars for profit. Every major event of the 19th and 20th centuries was eventually folded into the Rothschild conspiracy. Every war, every financial crisis, every political realignment that anyone found convenient to attribute to hidden hands. The accusations were false. They were also indestructible, which is the essential nature of anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. It does not require evidence because it is not about evidence. It is about the need to locate, in a single identifiable group, the explanation for everything that the world has done to you. The actual Rothschild family inside this mythology was a group of human beings living lives of extraordinary privilege and extraordinary pressure. The privilege was real. The houses were extraordinary. Waddesdon Manor in Buckinghamshire, which Ferdinand de Rothschild had built in the style of a French chateau, and filled with a collection of decorative arts that made museum directors reach for superlatives. Tring Park in Hertfordshire, where Walter Rothschild, the eccentric second Baron, had assembled one of the largest private natural history collections in the world, and where he drove around his estate in a carriage pulled by trained zebras. Ashton Wold in Northamptonshire, which Charles had rebuilt and managed as a model of wildlife conservation, the grounds maintained not for the aesthetic pleasure of the family, but for the moths and the butterflies and the beetles that Charles loved more than almost anything except Rossica. The pressure was also real. The Rothschild name was a burden as well as an inheritance. It carried expectations of excellence, of discretion, of the specific kind of public comportment that a family which had spent a century in the public eye had developed as its survival mechanism. You did not make scenes. You did not draw attention to the wrong things. You managed. You absorbed. You continued. When Charles Rothschild died in October of 1923, the family managed. They absorbed. They continued. Victor was 13. The encephalitis was not a fabrication. Charles Rothschild had been ill for years before the morning in the locked bathroom. The inflammation that had been consuming his brain from the inside had changed him, had taken the methodical, energetic, devoted naturalist and banker, and turned him into someone who suffered, who could no longer work with the consistency that had always defined him, who had been forced to watch his own capacities diminish with the helpless clarity of a man who knows exactly what he has lost and cannot stop the losing. The suffering was documented. It was real. The family was not inventing an illness when they described it as the cause of his death. They were simply choosing which part of the story of that illness to tell, the years of deterioration rather than the morning in the bathroom, the disease rather than the decision. This distinction matters. and it has mattered differently to different people across the decades since. Those who have written about Charles Rothschild with sympathy have argued that the encephalitis was the cause in the only meaningful sense, that a man whose brain had been ravaged by illness was not making a choice in the ordinary sense when he made the choice he made, and that describing his death as a consequence of his illness was not a lie but a recognition of the relationship between the disease and the outcome it eventually produced. Those who have written about what the concealment did to the family have argued something different. They have argued that the silence around the manner of Charles's death was not primarily a kindness to him, but a protection of the name, that the family chose the version of the story that preserved the Rothschild reputation at the cost of the truth, and that this cost was paid not by the family as an institution, but by the individuals inside it, particularly the children, who grew up knowing that there was a locked room in the family's history and that they were not permitted to enter it. Victor was the only boy. He had 3 sisters: Miriam, who would become one of the great naturalists of the 20th century, Liberty, who lived more quietly, and Nika, who would eventually flee the family's expectations entirely and make her life among jazz musicians in New York, becoming the patroness of Thelonious Monk and Charlie Parker, a figure whose story is extraordinary in its own right, and whose escape from the Rothschild world was itself a kind of answer to the question the family had never asked about what its members needed. Victor did not escape. Victor was the heir. He was the only son, which meant he was the continuation of the line, the carrier of the name and the title that would pass to him when his uncle Walter, who had inherited from Charles's death because Charles predeceased him, eventually died without issue. Everything the family was and had built was, in the most literal institutional sense, pointing at Victor. He could not leave in the way that Nika eventually left. He was it. He went back to Harrow after the funeral. He was 13 years old, the only son of a family whose name was one of the most famous in the world, whose father had just been found dead in a locked bathroom in Northamptonshire, and whose family had decided what the story of that death was going to be, and would like him to honor that decision. He honored it. He honored it for the rest of his life. He never spoke publicly about the manner of his father's death in any way that contradicted the family's account. He absorbed it, the way a 13-year-old absorbs the first lesson about what certain things cost to say, and he carried it into the next thing, and the thing after that. At Cambridge, in the early 1930s, Victor Rothschild was someone it was impossible not to notice. He drove a Bugatti. He collected rare books and art with the discriminating appetite of someone who had grown up surrounded by great collections and who had developed through that proximity a genuine aesthetic intelligence rather than merely the reflexive acquisitiveness of wealth. He played first-class cricket for the university and for Northamptonshire, which is to say he was good enough to compete at the highest amateur level of the sport that England treated, in that period, as one of the primary measures of a certain kind of gentleman. He was charming, physically imposing, intellectually formidable. He joined the Cambridge Apostles. The Apostles were a secret debating society, founded in 1820, meeting in private, electing their members by invitation only, conducting their discussions under a vow of secrecy that former members were expected to maintain indefinitely. In the early 1930s, the society was predominantly Marxist. The economic collapse of 1929 and the rising fascism in Europe had driven the political thought of Cambridge's most intellectually serious students sharply leftward, and the Apostles at that moment were the society where that leftward drift found its most concentrated expression. Victor joined. He described himself in later life as mildly left-wing, but never a Marxist. His characterization of his political position at Cambridge may be accurate. It may also be the characterization of a man who had spent several decades thinking about how to describe his Cambridge political sympathies in the context of a suspicion that he preferred not to confirm. What is not characterizable is the company he kept: Guy Burgess, Anthony Blunt, Kim Philby. The men who would become the most damaging Soviet penetration of British intelligence in the 20th century were Victor's friends. Burgess and Blunt lived in Victor's London flat. He gave Blunt £100 to purchase a Poussin painting in 1933. an act of friendship between two men who shared a passion for art, and also an act that connected Victor's money to a man who was at that time already working for Soviet intelligence. He knew Philby. He was part of the social world that these men inhabited. None of this proves what it has been used to suggest it proves. Social proximity is not espionage. Friendship with traitors is not treason. The fact that Victor Rothschild lived in a flat with two of the Cambridge Five does not establish that he was the fifth man, any more than the fact of Charles Rothschild's encephalitis established that it was the cause of his death in any simple sense. The gap between what the facts establish and what they have been used to imply is the space in which Victor Rothschild spent the last decade of his life. But at Cambridge, in 1932 and 1933 and 1934, none of this was the future. It was simply life. The particular life of a young Rothschild at the world's most intellectually concentrated university, surrounded by people who were brilliant and ideologically fervent and certain, with the certainty of young people who have not yet been tested by events, that they understood what was wrong with the world and what needed to be done about it. Victor drove the Bugatti. He played cricket. He collected his books. He inherited in 1937, when his uncle Walter died without issue, the barony that made him the third Baron Rothschild. He was 26 years old. He was Lord Rothschild now, which was a title his great-grandfather had received from Queen Victoria, and which carried with it responsibilities and expectations that the family had been accumulating and transmitting for 3 generations. His father had been the same age, 26 roughly, when he had understood that the barony was coming to him, that the name and the bank and the houses and the collections and the obligations were his to carry. Charles had carried them with the particular divided attention of a man who loved science more than finance, and who had done his duty by the finance anyway. Victor would carry them differently, though the carrying would produce its own kind of divided attention, its own kind of damage. When the Second World War began, Victor Rothschild went to work for MI5. This is the part of the story that Victor always wanted to be the whole of the story. He was proud of his war record with a pride that the people who knew him found occasionally slightly too insistent. He had done dangerous work. He had genuinely done dangerous work, defusing bombs and investigating sabotage operations with a physical courage that the authorities recognized with the George Medal, the military decoration for acts of bravery, not in the face of the enemy. He had run the Fifth Column operation, in which an MI5 officer named Eric Roberts masqueraded as the Gestapo's representative in London and identified hundreds of Nazi sympathizers who believed they were talking to an ally. It was skilled, dangerous, important work. Victor understood his war work as the definitive statement about his loyalties. He had worked for British intelligence. He had risked his life for the country. He had received the George Medal and the Legion of Merit from the Americans and the Bronze Star. He had the decorations. He had the record. He had, in the physical evidence of what he had actually done during the years when the world was being decided, the answer to any question about where his loyalties had been. The problem was that the question that would eventually be asked about his loyalties was not a question about the years when the Germans were bombing London, and his friends were his colleagues, and the enemy was in uniform and identifiable. The question was about the years before the war, when the enemy was an ideology rather than a nation, and when his friends had been making choices that they had not, at the time, announced to anyone. The men Victor had known at Cambridge, Burgess, McLean, Philby, Blunt, had all been recruited by Soviet intelligence in the early 1930s. They had all spent the decade before the war in the ordinary social world of the British educated class, going to parties and writing articles and building careers and conducting relationships and having conversations that did not announce themselves as the conversations of men who were working for a foreign intelligence service. They had been recruited quietly by people who understood that the best assets are the ones nobody is looking at, and they had been run quietly for years before anyone in British intelligence understood that the British establishment had been penetrated in a way it had never been penetrated before. Victor knew them. He lived with 2 of them. He was at parties with Philby. He moved through the same world. Did he know what they were doing? The The question has been asked by journalists and historians and former intelligence officers and the authors of several books for more than 50 years, and it has not been definitively answered. The weight of the evidence, including the denial of Victor's own former KGB controller, Yuri Modin, who stated explicitly that he had never named Rothschild as any kind of Soviet agent, suggests that Victor was not the fifth man in any operational sense. Christopher Andrew and Vasily Mitrokhin in the Mitrokhin Archive, which drew on the actual KGB files that Mitrokhin had spent years copying and smuggling to the West, named John Cairncross as the fifth man and made no mention of Rothschild as a Soviet agent. But the question was asked, and asking the question, in the world Victor moved in, the world of British intelligence and British establishment life and the British press, was itself a kind of verdict. You did not ask this question about people who were clearly innocent of it. You asked it about people in whom something, somewhere, had not quite resolved. Victor Rothschild spent the post-war decades building a life that was, by any external measure, of extraordinary distinction. He returned to Cambridge after the war and worked in the zoology department for 20 years, contributing to the scientific literature on fertilization and on the mechanisms of sperm motility, with a rigor and an originality that earned him fellowship of the Royal Society. In 1953, he became chairman of the Agricultural Research Council. He became worldwide head of research at Royal Dutch Shell, one of the largest corporations on Earth, managing a scientific operation of global scope. He was an advisor to Edward Heath and Margaret Thatcher, running the Central Policy Review staff, the government's think tank, under Heath and remaining in Thatcher's circle until the end of his life. He was a significant figure, not a peripheral one, not a figure who drifted through the post-war establishment as a name without substance. He was a scientist, an intelligence officer, a corporate executive, a government advisor, a peer, a man whose contributions to the institutions he served were genuine and were recognized as genuine by the people in a position to evaluate them. And through all of it, the question followed him. It surfaced first in the late 1970s, when the identification of Anthony Blunt as the fourth man reopened the question of the Cambridge spy network's full scope. Blunt had been known to British intelligence since 1964, when Michael Straight had identified him as a Soviet agent. He had been given immunity from prosecution in exchange for a confession, and had continued until 1979 as the Queen's surveyor of pictures. A fact that, when Margaret Thatcher acknowledged it in the House of Commons, produced a public reaction of sufficient magnitude to require several days of parliamentary management. After Blunt came the question of whether there was a fifth man. After the fifth man came the question of who, and among the names that circulated, Roger Hollis, the former director of MI5, who was formally cleared by Thatcher in 1981, various others who moved through and out of the inquiry's frame, was Victor Rothschild's. The specific accusation was this, that Rothschild had been recruited at Cambridge alongside his friends, that he had used his position in intelligence and in the establishment to pass information to Soviet handlers, and that his immunity from serious suspicion had been a product of his name and his connections rather than of his actual innocence. Victor did not believe in suffering this quietly. He was not his father, locked in a bathroom with an illness that had consumed him for years, and a family that had decided what was to be said about his death. Victor was combative. Victor had opinions and expressed them and sought platforms from which to express them, and was not, in the final analysis, a man who accepted imposed silences without resistance. In December of 1986, he published a letter in the British newspapers. It read, in the part that has been remembered and quoted since, "I am not, and never have been, a Soviet agent." This sentence is worth sitting with. It is the sentence of a man who has decided that the only way to answer a question is to answer it directly and publicly, and in his own name. It is also the sentence of a man who understands at some level that the question will not be answered by his answering it, that the suspicion has its own life, independent of what he says or what the evidence shows or what former KGB officers confirm. He published the letter anyway, because he was Victor Rothschild, and that was what Victor Rothschild did. The letter did not close the question. Nothing closed the question. The question was the kind of question that does not close, that has the particular resilience of a suspicion attached to a famous name during a period of genuine historical uncertainty, when the full scope of the Soviet penetration of British institutions was still being mapped, and when the discovery of each new traitor opened the possibility that the discovery of the next was imminent. He died on March 20th, 1990, at 79 years old. He died with the letter in the public record and the suspicion still unresolved, and the fifth man question still officially open in the sense that the official answer, John Cairncross, had not yet been publicly confirmed. The Metrokin Archive, which would provide that confirmation, was published in 1999, 9 years after his death. He did not live to see the question officially answered. He did not live to be officially cleared in the sense that the public confirmation of Cairncross as the fifth man would have provided. He died with the cloud still there, lighter than it had been in 1986, heavier than he deserved. The pattern that begins with Charles Rothschild's death in 1923 and continues through Victor's life has a third iteration that is worth stating plainly, because it is the iteration that makes the pattern visible as a pattern rather than as a sequence of unrelated tragedies. In July of 1996, 6 years after Victor's death, his son Amschel Rothschild was found dead in his room at the Hotel Le Bristol in Paris. He was 41 years old. He was the head of Rothschild Asset Management in London. He was the son of Victor's second marriage to Theresa Mayer, who had worked as Victor's assistant at MI5 during the war, and the half-brother of Jacob Rothschild, who had inherited the barony from Victor in 1990, and who was, by 1996, one of the most significant figures in British finance and philanthropy. Amschel was found hanged. The coroner stated that there were no sinister circumstances. The family made no public statement beyond the minimum that the circumstances required. The press covered the death and moved on. The manner of death was reported and was not concealed in any formal sense. It was in the newspapers. It was in the record. But the family's response to it was the response that the family had always had to the things it found impossible to speak about. They were present at the minimum. They said what needed to be said. They did not dwell. Charles Rothschild, 1923. Locked bathroom, throat cut, encephalitis, the official account. Amschel Rothschild, 1996, Paris Hotel, hanged. No sinister circumstances, the official account. Victor Rothschild, who lived between these two deaths, who was 13 when his father died in the way the family did not discuss, and 80 when his son was born, who would die in the way the family would also not discuss, was the connective tissue between them. He was the thread that ran from one locked door to another, across the 73 years between them, carrying a family's accumulated weight of things that could not be said and had not been said and would not be said. He spent his life in intelligence, in the work of knowing things that could not be said, in the management of secrets whose disclosure would damage institutions he served and people he loved, and a name he carried that had been built on the understanding that certain things were managed quietly, and certain doors were kept locked, and certain accounts of certain deaths were offered to the world in the version that preserved what needed to be preserved. He learned this at 13. He practiced it for 70 years, and then his son learned it at 41. And the family did what the family had always done, and the door was closed again, and the account was offered in the appropriate form, and the world moved on. Tring Park Mansion stands in Hertfordshire, 27 miles north of London, at the edge of the Chiltern Hills. It is a house of considerable scale, built in the 17th century, enlarged over the following 2 centuries, occupied by the Rothschild family from the 1870s until well into the 20th century. Walter Rothschild kept his famous natural history museum there, the collection that he spent a lifetime assembling, and that he eventually sold to the American Museum of Natural History in New York under circumstances that involved financial pressure and a long-running blackmail operation by a woman who had obtained compromising letters. The zebras he drove in harness through the grounds of the estate, the giant tortoises from the Galapagos, the menagerie of animals that Walter had assembled with the same systematic passion that his brother Charles had brought to the documentation of the world's fleas. Victor grew up at Tring. He grew up also at Waddesdon and at Ashton Wold, and at the London houses and at the other properties that the family maintained across the landscape of the British establishment. He grew up surrounded by collections of art, of natural specimens, of rare books, of the accumulated physical evidence of a family that had been gathering things for a century and that stored them in houses of sufficient size to contain what they had gathered. He grew up understanding, as children of such families understand, that the collections were not merely possessions, they were statements. They were the physical form of the claim the family was making about its own significance, the claim that it had been in the world long enough and had looked at the world carefully enough to have accumulated, in its houses and its museums and its banks and its networks, the most important things the world contained. He grew up understanding also what it meant to be the only son. The sisters were extraordinary. Miriam's scientific contributions were recognized eventually with a damehood, and Nika's flight to the jazz world of New York produced a life that was genuinely her own. But they were sisters. Victor was the son. The specific weight of that distinction in a family whose succession ran through the male line, whose barony passed from father to son, whose bank required a Rothschild at its center, was a weight that Victor carried from the day he was old enough to understand Itoa. He carried his father's death as part of that weight. He carried the knowledge of what had happened in the locked bathroom, or the knowledge of what he was not supposed to say had happened, which is its own kind of knowledge. He carried the understanding that the family had closed over the death the way a wound closes. Not cleanly, not without leaving a mark, but with the particular organic efficiency of a body that knows it needs to continue functioning and that closes what it needs to close in order to do so. The wound is still there. The mark is visible if you know where to look. You can find it in the letter he published in 1986, in the extraordinary act of a man who could not bear to have one more thing about his life be the thing that was not said. You can find it in the 30-year friendship he maintained with Peter Wright, the MI5 officer who wrote Spycatcher and who shared Victor's obsession with the question of who had really betrayed British intelligence, an obsession that makes more sense when you understand it as the obsession of a man who spent his professional life in the machinery of secrets and who needed more than almost anything to know that the secrets that had attached themselves to his own name were not the right secrets. You can find it in the way he talked about his war record, with a pride that people who knew him noticed was slightly elevated above what the record itself, distinguished as it was, required. He wanted the George Medal to be the answer. He wanted the bomb disposal work to be the last word. He wanted the letter in the newspaper to be the statement that closed the file. He wanted what every person wants who carries something that cannot be put down: resolution. The thing said, the question answered. The door finally opened and its contents finally examined, and the examination finally completed and the file finally closed. He did not get it. He died with the file open. The Cambridge Apostles, the secret society that Victor joined in the early 1930s and that counted among its members several of the men who would pass Britain's secrets to Moscow, had a practice called going beyond the veil. A member who left Cambridge was considered to have passed through a curtain into a different world, the world of adult life and professional responsibility, and was thereafter addressed in meetings as an angel rather than as a brother. The veil was a metaphor for the boundary between the interior life of the society, in which certain things were said among certain people in conditions of absolute secrecy, and the exterior life in which those same people presented different versions of themselves to a world that did not know what they knew or what they had said to each other. Victor spent his life behind veils, the veil over his father's death, the veil over his Cambridge friendships and what those friendships had cost him in reputation and in the trust of institutions that had reason to ask whether the friendships were all they appeared to be, the veil over the intelligence work that he could not discuss and that his critics could not evaluate, and that the people who suspected him could not verify, because the records were classified and the actors were dead or unwilling to speak, and the MI5 files that bore his name were not opened until decades after the questions had been most acute. His MI5 files were eventually released through the National Archives. They document a man who was interviewed by security branch on numerous occasions across the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s. Interviewed as a close associate of confirmed Soviet agents, interviewed in the context of the Fifth Man investigation, interviewed in The Patient. Methodical way that British intelligence interviewed the people who had been in the orbit of the Cambridge spies and who had not yet fully accounted for themselves. The files do not show a Soviet agent. They show a man under sustained suspicion, a man who was questioned repeatedly about his connections and his loyalties and his knowledge of what his friends had been doing while he drove his Bugatti and played his cricket and collected his books. A man who answered the questions and was interviewed again and answered them again and was interviewed again across decades with the particular patience that British intelligence applied to people it could not clear and could not charge and could not simply leave alone. He lived in the gap between clearance and accusation for 30 years. It is not a comfortable gap to live in. It is the gap where the wrong version of your life is always possible, where the account that exists in other people's heads is never quite the account that matches the actual record, where the thing you are not is the thing that follows you. His father had lived in a gap too, between the man he had been before the encephalitis and the man the encephalitis made him, between the energetic naturalist who cataloged fleas and bought nature reserves and met Rosica on a mountain, and the suffering man who locked himself in a bathroom and did not come out. The gap between those two men was the gap the family closed over in 1923, and the closing was itself a kind of erasure, not of Charles, not of his name or his contributions or his place in the family line, but of the specific truth of what had happened to him at the end and of what that truth might mean if it were allowed into the light. Victor was the boy who grew up inside that erasure. He did not become it. He became something else, something harder, more combative, more insistent on being seen as who he was, rather than who the family needed him to be, or who his enemies needed him to be, or who the question of the fifth man required him to be. He published the letter. He pursued the vindication. He was not quiet, but the erasure was there, underneath everything. The first locked door, the first thing that could not be said, the first lesson in the particular cost of belonging to a family that had decided, before he was old enough to have an opinion about it, what certain things were worth. Ashton Wold, the house in Northamptonshire, where Charles Rothschild died, was his personal creation. The house he had rebuilt and the grounds he had managed as a haven for the butterflies and moths he loved. The place where he was most himself, where the distance between the Rothschild banker and the naturalist who had described 500 species of flea was smallest. It was the house where he died. In the bathroom, with the door locked, on the 12th of October, 1923. Victor was 13, Miriam was 15, Liberty was 14, Nika was 10. Their father had been ill for years, the encephalitis taking him by increments in the way that brain diseases take their subjects, slowly, cruelly, in the particular register of a man who can see what is happening to him and cannot prevent it. His wife Rosica, the woman he had met in the Carpathian Mountains, the champion tennis player, the fierce, multilingual, devoted person who had been his partner for 16 years, survived him by 17 years. She lived until 1940. She raised the children. She managed the household and the aftermath of the death and the grief that could not be discussed in the terms that would have been most honest. She was a formidable woman, and she was devoted to her children, and she was also in the specific way that grief becomes when it cannot be fully spoken, carrying something that did not fully resolve. Victor remembered her with a specific kind of love that comes through even in the limited personal material he left behind. She had been the stable point of his childhood after 1923, the person who was still there, who managed, who continued. He had absorbed from her, perhaps, some of the capacity for continuation that he would need in the decades ahead, when the questions about his loyalty were at their most pointed and the temptation to simply withdraw from public life would have been, for a man of his wealth and his position, a genuine option. He did not withdraw, he continued. He published his science and ran his corporations and advised his governments and wrote the letter in 1986 and continued to argue for his own vindication until the capacity to argue was gone. The question of who Victor Rothschild really was, whether the fifth man claim was true, whether his Cambridge friendships constituted something more than friendship, whether the MI5 interviews across 30 years had been the interrogation of an innocent man or the management of a guilty one, has not been definitively resolved in the sense that his accusers and his defenders could agree on. What has been resolved in the formal sense is the fifth man question. The Mitrokin archive names John Cairncross. The KGB controller Yuri Modin denied Victor's involvement explicitly. The evidence for Victor's guilt be examined by serious historians and intelligent scholars rather than by journalists with a story to sell does not sustain the accusation that Roland Perry made in The Fifth Man, and that the British press amplified in the years when the question was most alive. What has not been resolved is the larger question of what Victor knew and when he knew it, whether he understood at some point during the years he shared his flat with Burgess and Blunt that his friends were working for Moscow, whether he told anyone what he knew or suspected, and if so, who and when. Whether the 30 years of MI5 interviews were the interrogation of a man who genuinely did not know what his friends had been doing, or the interrogation of a man who knew more than he was saying and who was negotiating through the sustained patience of a man who understood the game he was playing. The precise terms of what the institution he had served would ask of him in return for the question being not quite answered. These questions are in the files. The files are in the National Archives. The researchers who have worked with them have produced careful assessments that support the conclusion that Victor was not a Soviet agent in any operational sense. The conclusion satisfies the legal standard. It does not satisfy the historical standard, which is different, and it does not satisfy the human standard, which is different still. The human standard is this. Victor Rothschild was a man who was raised in a family that closed over certain things because the family's survival required it. He was 13 when he learned this. He was 13 when the bathroom door in Northamptonshire was the first locked door, and the encephalitis was the first account offered in place of the truth, and the silence was the first price extracted from a child who had not chosen the family he was born into and could not choose whether to carry its method of managing itself. He carried it for 79 years. He carried the locked door and the silence and the habit of managing certain things in certain ways that the family's survival required. He carried the Cambridge friendships and the flat he shared with Burgess and Blunt, and the question of what he knew in the 30 years of MI5 interviews, and the letter in the newspaper, and the failure of the letter to close what it was trying to close. He carried all of it to the end. There is a detail in the record of Victor Rothschild's life that is easy to miss and that, once noticed, is difficult to set aside. In 1986, the same year he published the letter in the British newspapers, Victor was reported to have played a role in the dismissal of the Director General of the BBC, Alasdair Milne. Milne had backed programs that had angered the Thatcher government: Secret Society, Real Lives, and a panorama edition called Maggie's Militant Tendency. The chairman of the BBC Board of Governors at the time was Marmaduke Hussey, who implied in his autobiography that Rothschild had initiated the dismissal. The detail sits in the record without a full explanation. Victor was, at that point, an opposition Labour peer, formally aligned with the party that was in opposition to Thatcher's government. He was also informally and by long practice an advisor to Thatcher personally, a relationship that cut across his formal political allegiance in ways that were consistent with a man who had always moved through the world as an individual of sufficient weight to be useful to anyone rather than simply a member of a party. The detail matters not because it establishes anything criminal or even improper in itself, but because it is the detail of a man who was, in his 80s, still operating in the rooms where decisions were made. Still a gray eminence. Still present, still consulted, still sufficiently connected to the institutions of British power that when those institutions needed something done, and needed it done quietly, someone thought of Victor Rothschild. He had spent 60 years being useful to those institutions. He had been useful to MI5. He had been useful to Shell. He had been useful to Heath and to Thatcher. He had been useful in the ways that people are useful when they know things and know the right people, and understand, from long experience, how the machinery of power operates and where to apply pressure to produce the outcomes that the machinery requires. His father had been useful to the bank. His grandfather had been useful to the government. The Rothschild usefulness was itself a kind of inheritance, the accumulated relationship capital of a family that had been lending money to governments and advising politicians and attending the meetings where the world's decisions were made for long enough that the relationship had become structural, woven into the architecture of British institutional life in ways that were not about any individual Rothschild, but about the name and what it had come to represent. Victor inherited this usefulness along with the barony and the houses and the collections and the bank. He exercised it for 70 years. He exercised it in ways that were straightforwardly beneficial and in ways that were more complicated, and in ways that are still being evaluated by the people who study the period and who have access through the files and the memoirs and the posthumous testimony of the people who knew him, to the record of what he actually did. He was not the boy his family pretended never existed. He was, if anything, the opposite. The boy who was made to be everything, to carry everything, to be the continuation of everything at 13 years old in the autumn of 1923, when the family closed over the locked bathroom, and the encephalitis became the account, and the account became the story, and the story became what was said. What was not said was the rest of it. Victor Rothschild died in Cambridge on March 20th, 1990. He was 79 years old. He had outlived most of the people who had known him at Cambridge, and most of the people who had worked alongside him at MI5, and most of the people who had been asked, over the preceding decades, to evaluate what he had been and what he had done. His son Jacob inherited the barony. His son Amschel continued at Rothschild Asset Management in London. His daughter Emma became an economic historian of distinction. His other children lived their lives. In July 1996, Amschel was found dead at the Hotel Le Bristol in Paris. He was 41 years old. The coroner said there were no sinister circumstances. The family said what the family said. The press reported it and moved on. The pattern that had begun on October 12, 1923 in the locked bathroom at Ashton Wold completed itself in a Paris hotel room 73 years later. The same gesture, the same family response, the same minimum of statement, and the same maximum of silence, and the same account offered to the world in the terms that preserved what needed to be preserved. Charles Victor Amschel. 3 generations, the locked door, the account, the silence. Victor was the middle of it. He was the boy who was 13 when the first door was locked, and he was the father who died 6 years before the second door was locked, and he spent the 66 years between those two events building the most distinguished public career of any Rothschild of the 20th century, and fighting, with the particular stubborn energy of a man who needed to be seen clearly, against the account of him that other people preferred to the truth. He is not the boy his family pretended never existed. He is the man his family could not quite see, who was too complicated for the account the family's method of self-presentation required, too insistent on saying certain things in public that the family's survival instinct suggested should be left unsaid, too marked by the first locked door to ever be entirely comfortable with locked doors. He published the letter. It was not enough. Nothing was enough. The question outlived him. The files are in the National Archives. The researchers are still working. The bathroom door at Ashton Wold has been open for 100 years. It took this long to look through it. There is something worth saying about what it means to be the only son. In a family like the Rothschilds, a family whose identity was organized around the continuity of the male line, whose bank required a Rothschild at its center, whose title passed from father to son, whose entire institutional architecture was built on the assumption that there would always be a next one. Being the only son is not simply a biographical fact. It is a structural role. It is the place in the machinery where the weight of everything that came before accumulates and waits to be transferred to the next generation. Charles Rothschild had been the only surviving son of his generation who could carry the line forward after his brother Nathaniel. The first Baron, the man known as Natty, the first Jewish peer in Britain, died without an heir that was quite right for the purpose. Walter, the second Baron, had assembled his famous zoological collection and driven his zebras and lived his extraordinary eccentric life, but had never married and had no children, and had in fact been engaged in a decades-long blackmail relationship with a woman who had obtained compromising letters and who extracted large sums of money from him throughout his adult life, a relationship that forced him eventually to sell his prized bird collection to the American Museum of Natural History. And that was itself kept as quiet as the Rothschild family method permitted. So the line went through Charles. And then Charles died in 1923, and the line went through Victor, and Victor was 13 and the only boy, and the barony was going to reach him eventually through Walter, who had no children and who died in 1937. And in the meantime, everything that Charles had been and done and built and loved and suffered was now Victor's to carry. The butterfly collection, the flea collection, the nature reserve at Wicken Fen, the relationship with the bank, the house at Tring, the knowledge of what had happened in the bathroom at Ashton Wold. He carried it. He was 13 and he had no choice, and he carried it for 66 more years until his own death in Cambridge in the early spring of 1990. The carrying produced what it produced: the distinguished scientific career, the wartime service, the government advising, the corporate leadership, the stubborn late-life campaign to have the question about his loyalty answered in the terms he thought it deserved. And underneath all of it, invisible unless you know where to look, the first lesson, the locked door, the account that was offered in place of the truth. The understanding, absorbed at 13 and never fully put down, that certain things cost more to say than to carry. He carried them. The Walter Rothschild Natural History Museum at Tring is now part of the Natural History Museum of London. It is open to the public. Visitors walk through the rooms that Walter filled with his specimens: the birds, the insects, the mounted animals, the meticulous catalogued evidence of a man who looked at the natural world with the same systematic passion that his brother Charles brought to the documentation of the world's fleas, and that Victor brought eventually to the zoology department at Cambridge, and to the question of sperm motility and fertilization that occupied his post-war scientific years. The three brothers, Natty, Walter, Charles, and the son Victor, and the son Amschel, who died in Paris, and the barony that runs now through Jacob and then Nat. They are a line, in the genetic sense and in the sense that the things that families transmit across generations are transmitted whether the transmitters choose to transmit them or not. The thing the Rothschilds transmitted, along with the bank and the title and the houses and the collections and the extraordinary capacity for the accumulation of knowledge that runs through the family's naturalists and scientists and scholars across multiple generations, was this: the understanding that certain things are managed rather than spoken, that the account offered to the world is not the same as the truth of what happened, that the distance between what is said and what is true is a distance that money and name and institutional position can maintain within limits for a long time. The limits showed in Victor. He was the place where the method encountered its own constraint, where the boy who had absorbed the first lesson at 13 grew into the man who was not willing, entirely, to apply it to himself. He could manage other things. He could be discreet about his father's death and about his wartime intelligence work and about the precise nature of his relationship with Peter Wright and about the 100 other things that a man of his experience and his connections was asked to keep quiet. But he could not be quiet about the accusation. He could not manage the fifth man question in the way the family's method suggested it should be managed, by not responding, by not dignifying it, by letting it dissipate in the silence that the family had learned over generations was often more effective than direct engagement. He engaged directly. He published the letter. He sought vindication in the court of public opinion and in the back channels of intelligence that he still had access to through his former colleagues. He was not manageable on this point. The accusation had touched something that could not be managed, the question of whether his life had been what he said it had been, whether the war record and the science and the government service and the decades of useful work were what they appeared to be or were the cover story for something else. He needed the question answered in a way that the family method did not require of most of its members, because the family method assumed that the thing being managed was external, the world's perception of the family, and not internal, a member's own knowledge of who he was. Victor needed the external question answered because the external question had become entangled with the internal one in a way that would not resolve without resolution. He did not get resolution. He got the letter in the newspaper and the continued investigation, and the Cambridge historians who came after his death to the careful conclusion that the evidence did not support the accusation, and the Metrokin archive naming Cairncross and not mentioning Rothschild. He got vindication, of a kind, in the historical record after he was gone. It did not give him what he needed. Nothing could have given him what he needed, which was the absence of the question, which was only possible if the question had never been asked, which was only possible if he had lived a different life, which was only possible if he had been a different person with a different history, in a different family. He was not a different person. He was Victor Rothschild, the only son, the heir, the baron, the scientist, the intelligence officer, the government advisor, the man who shared a flat with two traitors and spent 40 years explaining why that did not mean what people kept insisting it meant. He was the boy who was 13 when the bathroom door at Ashton Wold was locked, and who was still, in some fundamental sense, standing outside that door when he died in Cambridge in the spring of 1990. The houses remain. Tring Park was eventually sold and is now an arts college. Waddesdon Manor, which passed through various Rothschild hands, is now in the care of the National Trust and is open to the public. Its rooms maintained and its collection displayed and its garden visited by hundreds of thousands of people each year who know it as one of the great Victorian houses of England and who do not, most of them, know the specific human history of the family that built it and lived in it and eventually gave it away. Ashton Wold, Charles's house, the house where he died in the locked bathroom in October of 1923, remained in Rothschild hands through the 20th century. Miriam, Victor's sister, lived there and continued her scientific work there into old age, maintaining the grounds in the spirit of her father's conservation work, the butterflies and moths still finding in that managed landscape the habitat that Charles had designed for them a century earlier. The grounds at Ashton Wold are among the finest butterfly habitats in England. This is Charles Rothschild's legacy: the nature reserves, the wildlife surveys, the list of 284 sites that he compiled in 1915, and that formed the foundation of Britain's nature reserve system. The Royal Society for Nature Conservation, which grew from the organization he founded, carries his work forward. The butterflies at Ashton Wold are the specific, physical, living continuation of a man's devotion to the natural world, expressed in the only currency that genuinely survives, the actual presence of the living things that the devotion was meant to protect. Charles Rothschild was a great man whose greatness was in the meadows and the fens and the preserved habitats of a country that would have lost more of them without him. He was also a man whose death was described in terms that protected his family's reputation, rather than in terms that honored the truth of what had happened to him. Both things are true. They do not cancel each other. Victor Rothschild was a distinguished scientist, an intelligence officer of real courage, a government advisor of genuine usefulness, and a man under 30 years of sustained suspicion that the evidence does not fully support. He was also the boy who was 13 when the first locked door taught him what certain things cost. Both things are true. They do not cancel each other. Amschel Rothschild was the head of a major financial institution and the son of one of the most significant British figures of the 20th century, and he died at 41 in a Paris hotel room in 1996 in circumstances that the family addressed in the minimum terms the situation required. This too is true, and it does not cancel anything. The pattern across 3 generations of a single family is not a conspiracy and not a crime and not a cover-up in the legal sense. It is a method, the method of a family that had built its name on discretion and had maintained its position through discretion, and that applied discretion even to the things that most required its opposite. The thing most requiring the opposite was the boy of 13 in 1923, outside the locked bathroom at Ashton Wold, being told what the account was going to be. He deserved the truth. He deserved to be told, in language that matched what had actually happened, that his father had suffered enormously, and that the suffering had ended in the only way the suffering could find to end, and that this was not a thing to be hidden or managed, but a thing to be mourned in the full and honest terms that any death deserves. He was not told this. He was given the account, he carried the account for 66 years, and then the account was given again in a different hotel in a different decade to a different set of people standing outside a different door. The bathroom at Ashton Wold is not locked anymore. The record is in the National Archives. The account can be set down now, and the truth can be said, and the boy of 13 can be seen clearly for the first time in 100 years. He was Victor Rothschild. He was the only son. He carried everything that was put on him to carry, for as long as he lived. That was both too much and not enough. It was what was asked of him, and he carried it. That is the whole story. The door is open now. In 1935, 2 years after Burgess and Blunt had moved into Victor's London flat, and 2 years before Victor inherited the barony from his uncle Walter, Victor published his first scientific paper. It was about the fertilization of sea urchin eggs, the mechanics of how a sperm cell penetrates an egg, the sequence of biochemical events that occur in the seconds between contact and union, the specific membrane changes that prevent the entry of a second sperm once the first has succeeded. It was careful, methodical, original work, and the work of a man who looked at the natural world with the same quality of attention that his father had brought to the documentation of fleas and that his uncle Walter had brought to the assembly of his extraordinary zoological collection. The quality of attention was itself an inheritance, transmitted through the family in ways that were neither financial nor titular, but that were, in their own terms, as valuable as anything the bank or the barony conveyed. He published scientific papers for 20 years. He continued the work in the zoology department at Cambridge after the war, adding to the literature on fertilization and on the properties of sperm with a consistency of output that reflected the genuine scientific mind. Not the dilettante who dabbles in science as one of several aristocratic interests, but the researcher who finds in the specific question the specific answer and who publishes it in the specific language that science requires. He was elected Fellow of the Royal Society in 1953. The fellowship was not honorific. It was the recognition of peers who had evaluated the work and had found it sufficient. He understood his scientific work as something separate from the rest of it. From the bank and the title and the intelligence work and the Cambridge friendships and the post-war life as a corporate executive and government advisor. He understood it perhaps as the place where he was most clearly himself, where the identity imposed by name and title and family expectation fell away, and what remained was a man looking carefully at a specific question and trying to answer it in the most honest terms available. The sea urchin eggs do not care about the barony. The fertilization mechanics do not require the intervention of the fifth Baron Rothschild. The science exists independently of everything that Victor was required to be outside the laboratory, and in the laboratory he could be simply the scientist, asking the question, following the evidence, publishing the result. He could not always be simply the scientist. The world would not permit it. The world had a use for a Lord Rothschild who was also an MI5 officer and also a government advisor, and also the heir to one of the most famous financial names in the world, and the world extracted that use whether Victor experienced the extraction as comfortable or not. He did not, it seems, always experience it as comfortable. The letter in 1986 is the most visible evidence of this, the refusal to accept the identity that was being constructed around him, the insistence on stating in public and in his own name who he was not. But there are other evidences in the memoirs of people who knew him and in the fragments of his own writing that are available of a man who found the multiplicity of his public identities: the baron, the scientist, the intelligence officer, the government advisor, the suspected traitor. Genuinely exhausting, and who would have preferred to be fewer things, more simply, in a world that was more interested in the sea urchin eggs than in whether the man examining them had or had not been passing secrets to Moscow. He was not permitted to be fewer things. The world needed all of him, or believed it did, or found it more interesting to consider all of him than to settle on any one version and let the others go. He died in Cambridge, which was the city of the science and of the apostles and of the friendships and of the flat and of all the things that had both made his life and required so much of it. He died in Cambridge, which was also the city where his uncle Walter Rothschild, the second Baron, had been a student before he became the eccentric master of Tring and its zebras and its 200,000 flea specimens. He died in the city that his family had moved through across several generations, in the institution that had claimed the most interesting members of the British intellectual establishment for a century, in the place that was both the origin of the question that had followed him and the place where, in the quieter seasons of his life, he had done his best work. His scientific papers are in the literature. The sea urchin eggs are documented. The fertilization mechanics are described with the care that genuine science requires. Whatever else is disputed about Victor Rothschild's life, the papers are not disputed. They exist, and they are what they are, and they will remain in the record when the fifth man question has been as fully answered as it is going to be answered, and the MI5 files have been read, and the historians have reached their careful conclusions and moved on. The science will outlast the suspicion. That is perhaps the most useful thing that can be said about the distance between what Victor Rothschild was accused of being and what the evidence shows he was. The boy of 13 in 1923 grew into an old man of 79 in 1990. Between those 2 points stretched a life of extraordinary range and extraordinary complication, the science and the cricket, and the flat with the spies and the bombs and the blitz, and the medal and the barony and the shell boardroom and the Downing Street meetings, and the letter in the newspaper and the files at the National Archives, and the son who would die 6 years later in a Paris hotel room. He carried all of it. He carried what his family gave him to carry, and what history gave him to carry, and what the accident of his Cambridge friendships gave him to carry, and what his own nature, combative, insistent, unwilling to accept the managed account when the truth was available, gave him to carry additionally, because he would not put it down. The locked door at Ashton Wold was the first thing. The account offered in place of the truth was the first account. And Victor Rothschild spent 66 years between that first account and his own death discovering, in various settings and at various costs, what it meant to live inside a family that had decided, before any of its individual members were old enough to choose, that certain things were not said and certain doors were kept locked and certain accounts were maintained, because the alternative was a kind of exposure that the name could not afford. He was a great man inside a great family, inside a great tradition of keeping the door locked. And the greatest thing he did, perhaps, greater than the science and the medal and the government advising, though those things were real and were significant, was to refuse, at least in the case of his own reputation, to keep the door locked. He published the letter. He said, "I am not, and never have been, a Soviet agent." The door was not fully opened by the letter, but the attempt to open it was genuine. The attempt was everything for a man raised in a family where the attempt itself was the transgression. The bathroom at Ashton Wold has been open for 100 years. The Hotel Le Bristol room in Paris has been cleaned and relet many times since 1996. The Cambridge files are in the National Archives, waiting for the next researcher who needs to know. And somewhere in the record, in the papers of a man who spent 66 years carrying what was put on him and fighting, with the stubbornness of someone who needed to be seen clearly against the versions of himself that other people preferred to the truth, is the boy of 13. He is still there. He was always there. The door was just locked.